Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much for a fascinating discussion, in actual fact. And I have some daft laddie questions for you.
Loaded questions.
Daft laddie.
Oh, okay.
You mentioned courage, and when were you last courageous? This is hard quiz, by the way. No.
Yeah. You want me to know?
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
I'll tell you. It's a really important question. I'm close. Do you mind if I stand?
Yes.
You wouldn't know it, but I'm close to retirement. Okay, one of the things that I think is very important for older people at work is to model courage. Yeah? So an example of that was when I was a chair of an ethics committee, research ethics committee, and we were told this is actually an old case, but it's a good example. We were told that we were 17% compliant, 17% compliant. Now that's pretty bad. I'd just taken over as the chair, so the deputy vice chancellor called me in and said, "Look here, no more of this, Robinson. By this time next year, I want this to be 90% compliant." You see, so I said, "Okay, we'll go away." We talked about it in the committee. We came up with a plan when we said that we will change things around in 2 years. The important point about this is that when you exhibit courage, then it starts to become a social thing. Yeah. So we sent the plan in. The DVC return email had a year. You've only got a year. We've got somebody coming who is an external body coming to check us, Ofsted, and we wrote back and said no. Jokingly, we said, if you want a year, then you'll have to supply us with the rubber truncheons in order to encourage people. And that's not going to work, because what we need to have is the development of a research culture, and research cultures do not develop with rubber truncheons. And then everything went silent at the top. 2 years later, we got 89% compliance, but it was a continual pushback.
You met your KPIs, is that right?
Yeah, but only 2 years later.
So this is the interesting question that I was going to lead towards,
yeah.
Essentially in terms of leaders, and you had some examples of
leaders, and a lot of that is, you didn't mention power, and you did mention money. Because a lot of that is to do with power, how do we change that model that is geared towards power and is also geared towards greed and money in a lot of examples?
Yeah, of course.
Yes.
Of course. First point, I think again, we mustn't be surprised that is the model. That has been the default position historically in every situation. Church, politics, business, etc. So how do we change it? Well, the first thing I would argue is that we do not make it into a paradigmatic struggle. Your paradigm is no good, my paradigm is much better, and we will, because then you're walking into the same polarized position. I would argue that the way to change it is exactly through dialogue, so that you make these people, you enable these people to be more fully accountable. Yeah. Very brief example of questions that make people accountable, or lack of them, in the Abu Ghraib jail where the dreadful abuse occurred. The CIA guys said to the MPs, "Go in there and sort them out before we interrogate them." Nobody bothered to say, "What do you mean?" As soon as you have that simple question, "What do you mean?" this person has to publicly, because it's in a group, has to publicly articulate and give an account of what they mean. They have to take responsibility for what they mean, and therefore what consequences might. So it's the development of that kind of culture. McNamara's approach, I think, is part of the way forward, getting an architecture in there, but there's also individuals like the older people within the organisation who should take responsibility for that kind of pushback. It's the continual example of pushback. Now, you guys in Australia are good at that. I mean, Aussies never just accept things. Yeah. There's always a pushback. Or is that true?
But it hasn't made our politicians.
No.
I think. And that's the question, I think, when they put their hand up, when you said, what is this? Why do we not trust our politicians anymore? Or we seem to have lost faith in politics and indeed in religion.
Yeah. I think partially because we've bought into the myth of politicians as being superior beings, and priests and bishops as being superior beings. And once you realise they're not, it's actually quite difficult. Yeah. It's actually quite difficult. Look at Brexit. Nobody quite knows where to start at the moment. If Mrs May had begun the process with dialogue, recognised the complexity, and spent 6 months deciding where she was going to go and how they're going to get there, then we would have been there. So, but the point I want to make is that assumed model, that myth, has always got to be pushed back again. So I think you're right. There's never going to be so go on.
How do you build trust then? Again, I suppose is my question. In terms of looking at these issues,
how do we work with tertiary institutions, with schools perhaps? Do you have any suggestions there in terms of building this individual trust and collective trust?
Yeah. Absolutely. It's got to come back to dialogue. It's got to come back to the experience of dialogue, and the public experience of dialogue. Most students in higher education do not practice responsibility. Now, what they do is they write out the essay and they get it in at the end, but in the process, they've never actually been responsible for what they think. And we've never tested that. Now, this is why I generally now never give lectures. I actually turn to somebody in the audience and say, tell me what you think that means. Now, as soon as I ask you that, how are you feeling? Seriously, how are you feeling? Look at his eyes. Yeah. Okay.
That's fine.
Okay. No, I'm not. The point about this is it's simple, and we complicate it. Yeah, and we complicate it because of the powers. But as I move towards you, because we're not used to giving an account. We're not used to the practice of responsibility in our learning experience. And that, I think, says that our pedagogy has to be re-examined in terms of what is the responsibility of a student, what is the accountability of the teacher, is the teacher open to questions, all these sort of things. Michael Oakeshott says, despite being a right winger, he's quite a good philosopher. He said, higher education is the adventure of an unrehearsed critical conversation. When did you last have an unrehearsed critical conversation? Most students do never have unrehearsed critical conversations. It's all rehearsed. Yeah. And people find ways around it. But I was sharing with my friends in the movement the other night. I think Levinas says ethics begins with the face of the other. Yeah? I believe that leadership begins with the face of the other. Yeah? And I believe that learning begins with the face of the other. Yeah? Eye contact. And brilliantly, last night, one of your members, she was wonderful. We began a conversation, and her eyes were sort of going. She was obviously thinking. Did you know neuro-linguistic programming? Have you come across it? She was thinking, and then her hands did this, and then she smiled. So there were several narratives going on in her as we were engaging, and then she came up with some lovely ideas. Go on.
No.
I want to open it up to
Sure.
the audience now, because we want to extend this question of ethics and responsibility.
Yeah.
Yes, tell us your name.
So my name's Alice. Thank you so much for a great talk.
Thank you.
You talk about a lot about responsibility and learning. When you're having those difficult conversations, say someone's got Islamic phobic ideas and they're expressing you to them directly, do you think you have the responsibility, or do you think they have the responsibility?
Fantastic question.
To have a bit of a thought and to critically think about what they're saying.
Fantastic question.
And also the responsibility of those mistruths
Yeah.
in our community and the diversity
Absolutely.
we see.
I'm going to reply with a story. A little while ago, before I did business ethics, I was doing sexual ethics in a class, and we had 40 conventional, 18 to 21-year-old Western-type students over here. We had 6 ladies wearing headscarves and so forth over here, and we had an older black man who was also Muslim. And we got onto homosexuality, and the black man said, "It's obvious, homosexuality is an illness. So we're just going to have to cure them. Off they go to the doctors and we'll sort them all out." And I thought, wow, this is going to lead to a fantastically interesting conversation. And there was total silence in the room. So I said, time out. All right? And I asked these guys over here why they weren't pushing back. They didn't want to push back because he was older, and he was black, and he was Muslim. So there were at least 3 narratives there that they were trying, that they were unsure of. So we said, well, how are we going to get a conversation going? Well, we might ask this guy a question. What do you mean? And they asked the question, what do you mean by an illness? So suddenly he had to be responsible for his own attitude, his own worldview, his own ideas, and give an account of them. It wasn't a very good account. And as he was giving that, he began to become aware that it wasn't a very good account. But unless he'd been challenged with the question, he wouldn't have been aware. And then I trained a long time ago as a psychiatric social worker, and my psychologist tutor was a guy who was into behavioral therapy. In the 60s, he was sent homosexuals by the court for aversion therapy. Wow. So we got into that kind of conversation, and we got into what does that say about respecting another person? Core principle of respect. Now, by that time, these guys over here were starting to get into lots of good conversation, but this was not conversation about identity politics, and it wasn't heroic challenging. So I think heroism in ethics is a dangerous path to take. It was questioning, honest, respectful questioning. Okay.
Once again, thank you for your talk, Professor. I'm Claude Bostwick, I'm a Catholic priest.
Hey.
And, I also work with Pax Christi and his organisation. But last night we had a meeting, actually, a Pax Christi meeting, and we were talking about Muslims and the whole myth about violence and so on. And how do you deal with that? And one of the things I said was, the way I deal with it is, I have never met one that I'm afraid of.
Yes.
This sort of stuff. I was thinking when we talk about eye contact and dialogue and so on. That's one part of my input. The other thing is, while we were talking, I kept thinking of a leader who has come to the fore in recent weeks, and it's about love. And would you like to comment on that?
Of course.
And I'm talking about Jacinda Ardern.
Yeah, of course. And absolutely. The first point about Muslims, fantastically important. This is why the movement is such an incredible, but particularly also Gullen's thinking. Gullen's thinking is really worth, I'm not an Islamic expert. I've got some expertise in terms of moral philosophy and so forth and so on. But this is a much better book to buy. It's much cheaper. It's much cheaper. I recommend it for anyone's birthday or for any Christmas presents. And in there, you'll see some of his theology, which is very close to Christian theology, very close to Aristotelian theology. It's focused in peace building. So that whole Pax Christi thing is absolutely massive. As for the wonderful Prime Minister of New Zealand, what really, I mean, I don't know, I've heard her speak, but what really impressed me was not her empathy, but her attention. When you see her amongst all these people, it's almost as if there's a stillness in the midst of all this conversation. She's just focused. Now that an academic, ethical response might be that is exactly what Aristotle talks about in terms of the virtues. The virtues are not in the extreme; they're in the middle. They're the mean. And when you're living those is when you become megalopsychos, the great soul. And I think she's got a great soul. Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
Hello, Professor. My name is Carolyn. I'm a policymaker, so I'm very interested in bridging the gap between the vision of leadership and the practice of leadership within an organization. I think one of your first few slides says that most of the practice of leadership consists of defending the institution and the practices. And most people would say that in the course, how they determine whether they're doing the right thing or not is simply by following what their job is meant to be doing. Usually you'd hear people say, I was just doing my job. Yeah. And so I'm doing writing on this because I want to sort of publish something for public sector professionals to say, in the course of your work, you don't directly take direction from a leader. You deduce the leadership via the processes, the procedures, and the practices. You know, when you sign on to an institution, you have your code of conduct, you have your procedures, and all that. So I'm interested in very practical applications of how in your experience working with the police, for example, can you distill some of those leadership principles into things that can be decoupled from the leader figure and into the culture?
Terrific. So you're saying you want to find a culture of responsibility, where individuals will take responsibility for their actions, and
so they can have a way of assessing their own.
Yeah, absolutely. The argument certainly is that that's what a leader is about, enabling that culture to develop. But you're looking for some practical ways of doing that, yeah? Okay. Several things. First of all, you can make sure you get a narrative. Okay, narratives are really important because people remember narratives. People do not remember principles. There's good research which says that in boards, well, actually, they either don't remember the principles or they don't remember how to use the principles. There's good research in boards, especially in healthcare, where values audits have been done, and the board, after 45 minutes, say, yep, first question, what are your values and principles? And they get them. Whoa! So at the end of that 45 minutes, they're all very pleased. Next question, can you name a deliberation or decision that you took in the last 12 months when these principles or values were embodied explicitly or implicitly? None in the research so far have been able to do that. And that tells you that the values of organizations like that are like trophies. And you put them in the trophy cabinet and you bring them out once a year and you polish them. So it's critical, it is absolutely critical that we talk about those values and that they are part of our conversation. I go back to my grandson. He talks about justice. Yeah, so let's blooming well talk about it. What do you mean by that? Do you know how many meanings there are of the word justice? Lots. Equality is even worse. There are over 100 logically distinct definitions of the word equality. And so you can't understand equality unless you know what it looks like. And you can't know what it looks like if you're not in dialogue, if you're not talking about it. I know that word. You know, that's what it means, because I can see it. So the culture has got to be like that, and it's therefore got to have narrative, it's got to have exemplifications of courage, Arthur Anderson, when he began his work as an accountant, before he turned to the dark side, or at least his organisation turned to the dark side, he had a wonderful narrative. His first time that he was working with the railway group of Chicago, he went in with the books. The guy behind the desk said, "I'd like you just to change the figures there and there, okay, and then we'll pay you your money." And Arthur, the young Arthur, turned to him and said, this is the other Arthur, and said, "There ain't enough money in the whole of Chicago that will make me change those figures."
And that's a good
Spot to finish, I think, in terms of ethical behaviour. That's very, very, very important.
Thank you.
so much Professor Robinson on what I'm doing.
And all I can say is it's complicated, isn't it?
And we should
complex.
We should
It's
glory in
complex
that. We should glory
yes.
in it.
Well, that's a good point. Yes, yes, indeed. And for me, it was wonderful just thinking about it and throwing light on some of those concepts that you were talking about. And I think it's very important for us, in actual fact, to reflect. What is it to have integrity? What is it to have an ethical frame? And how do we encourage this amongst our young people and our adults and our politicians and our banks? That's a joke. That's not a joke at all.
No.
Okay, so I'd like to call on Margaret Piper, Director of the Migrant Programs Advisory, to actually come and give a vote of thanks on behalf of Affinity. Would you like to go to this?
Can you hear me at the back? I'll use my thespian voice.
Excellent.
Simon, thank you so much. So often one goes to presentations and you find it terribly interesting and you walk away and you get on with the rest of your life. Today I think that this is a presentation that I will be thinking about for a very long time. I suspect others will too. It will come up in dinner party conversations, it will come up when we encounter things. Hopefully it will guide us in the way that we engage in the very many aspects of our lives. So thank you for giving us such a valuable and insightful presentation.
Thank you so much.
From Affinity.
Thank you. Have we got to go to? Good. Shouldn't I do this? Or shouldn't there be a...